Aram can be challenging for new players given that you are forced to pick one of 3 characters, but since the map revolves around team fights and prevents hearthing, some heroes are more desirable than others. To help people that haven't played the game mode before or maximise your chances, I've created a tier list to help you choose the heroes with higher win rates and better utility on these maps. I'm sure you've all seen a tier list before and you know you can skip to the end to see my thoughts, but stick around if you want to learn more about each hero and which builds are most effective on Aram. Believe it or not, there is a wrong way to play some of these heroes effectively. We'll start with S tier. These are heroes that you should insta-pick if you see them, though I will put one small caveat in here. If you're not confident with any of these S tier picks, i.e. you've never played them before, it might be more sensible to pick someone you are confident with and jump into training or versus AI to learn how best to utilise one of these heroes. Since I'm a healer main, let's start with the healers. Firstly, the undisputed king of patch 2.550, Rhaegar. The recent buffs provide Rhaegar with unmatched healing output and utility. The preferred build here sees you speccing most talents into your Earthbind totem, which at later levels debuffs the enemy and provides you with additional healing and damage. You can opt for lightning build, but this is only effective if you have a tank like Joanna that is happy to sit in the backline. We have 2 more S tier healers, the first of which is Deckard. Deckard can be slow to start, but is unmatched at late game. Level 13 defines most comps, e.g. if you have lots of melee or closely grouped allies, the splash healing of Potion of Revival is incredible. Though if you have a team with lots of squishies, Super Healing Potion can provide them with good resets. Finally, Malfurion. Because of the nature of team fights and closely grouped enemies, the healing output of Moonfire is incredible, while the utility provided by Root can be devastating. Level 1 here defines most builds. If you're playing a double healer, I like to go for Vengeful Roots, as once again this can snowball in the late game. There is only one tank that has crept its way into S tier, and that's Joanna. Her self-sustained shields and unstoppable talents allow her to happily sit in the enemy backline and be a nuisance. One of the most effective ways to snowball in Aram is to combo CC on unsuspecting enemies, so if you have a character that can just go unstoppable, you're out of luck. We have a few bruises in S tier, which is to be expected since they typically have much better self-sustain than other heroes. Artanis is able to participate in long team fights and puts out significant damage thanks to twin blades, while a well-executed blade dash phase prism combo can catch out ranged assassins deep in the enemy backlines. Next we have Thrall. Once again excellent self-sustain thanks to Ancestral Wrath and Forceful's Grace. Thrall also has great poke that scales towards endgame, while the slows provided by Earthquake and Thunderstorm can catch those pesky ranged assassins. And finally Gazlo. You can't go wrong as most builds are effective here, but the undisputed king of Aram is Bomb build. Level 20 Bomb Toss is an easy GG for a single lane map, since the bomb splits and covers half the map. Lastly, S tier ranged assassins, since there are no melee assassins that feature here. Simply because melee assassins typically rely on dive, which isn't very effective when you rarely catch someone overextending on a solo lane. Let's start with Nazeebo. Most builds are effective, such that you can flex your talent picks to counter the enemy team. For example, spiders if the enemy team consists of lots of squishies, while toads if there is lots of heavy frontline or lack of wave clear, and wall if you have good communication and combo. Azmodan, the Dunk King, which is pretty much what you're going to be doing here. His utility of buffing minions is hampered since there's only one lane and set of minions, so your build revolves around gluttony stacking annihilation, though because of the long cooldowns, teams with good healing can often counter. Zul'jin. All builds are effective, though I find that the Twin Cleave build is most effective towards the later game. Your ult pick is down to preference, so if you're having a hard time surviving, then go Tazingo, or Guillotine if you need extra damage. Vala is another example of a reactive hero. Go Hungering Arrow if you want to punish the backline, or multi-shot for reliable wave clear and damage to grouped enemies. Strafe can be devastating if the opposing team lacks CC. Li Ming, the true glass cannon of Heroes of the Storm. If you have heavy frontline, you can afford to go artillery build and pick up all the talents for your orb. Otherwise, the utility of your teleport build provides you with decent escape and engage. Zagara is great at sustained damage and wave clear. Later game their minions scale very well and act as a great buffer to soak incoming ranged attacks. Devouring Maw is the preferred ult here, though you will sometimes see Nidus Network for the additional self-sustain. And finally Mephisto. The preferred build sees him stacking all talents into Lightning Nova for reliable sustained damage. There are two issues to point out. Firstly, a smart opposition with decent CC can quickly counter Mephisto using Shade too close, and you need to be careful not to dive with low health, as this can sometimes be a death sentence. On to A tier healers. Now I may be biased, but this is where I have placed the majority of healers. We will start with Anduin or Manduin. For max healing stats, the Divine Star build is preferred here, though Flash Shield can be effective if you have a Joanna or tank sat in the backline. Similarly, Light Bomb is effective with heavy frontline, or Holy Word Salvation is huge if the enemy lacks CC. Stukov again has great sustained healing if his trait is played correctly. There are two viable builds here. Most people will go Lurking Arm because you can pin enemies behind their gate. The weighted Postule can output some great damage and slow at later levels. Brightwing is great if you are new to Heroes of the Storm or not very confident, since their healing is passive. You just have to be in the general vicinity of your allies to heal them. You can either go full heal build, or if you have good communication, the Polymorph hybrid build can be super effective at bursting down enemies. Uther. He can be tough to keep up with healer's stats, and mana is an issue. I would recommend picking up Hammer of the Lightbringer to help, but where he becomes super useful is with his CC. If you can pick up Divine Storm at 10, Uther can stun people for a total of 2.75 seconds. Lucio. Similar to Brightwing, Lucio's passive healing is hard to keep up with, especially since you will almost certainly be within range of most your team. Picking up Party Mix will basically guarantee this. As for ults, Sound Barrier is good to counter CCing ults like Grav Bomb or Graviton Surge, but I find High Five to be more successful for healing output and Unstoppable. Morales is an effective single target healer, so she is very good with strong front line. I prefer to spec into healing talents, but sometimes you see people going for grenade builds, since this is effective with enemy tanks with large health pools like Diablo or Stitches, and for Christ's sake, don't go Medivac. Lily is both an effective main or off healer. Speccing into Healing Brew and Cleanse is suggested, but Dragon build can be effective if your team lacks damage. Lastly, Tyrande. Again, another hero with a few possible builds. Either spec into Light of Elune or go heavy on the Owl or Hunter's Mark for increased damage output. But most builds do rely on sustained auto attacks, so bear this in mind. There is one support in A tier, and that's Zarya. The shields offered by Personal Shield and Shield Ally are enormous helps in team fights. Added to this, that you will spend most of the time at high or max energy, making your damage output surprisingly high. There are a couple of reactive builds available to you here. Grenade build can be super effective against enemy team comps heavy with ranged assassins, or basic attack build against heavy melee comps. Though if you have a diving tank like Nubrak or Blaze, then speccing further into your shield ally can be of huge assistance. As for ults, I would always recommend picking Graviton Surge because of the huge combo potential, and the silence provided by Graviton kills at level 20 is huge. A tier tanks. Again, there are a few good options here, mainly because of the strong CC capabilities they offer. Starting with Stitches. Now, I considered Stitches for S tier because there is one ability that is a little broken in Aram, and that's Hungry for More. At late game, I have got to 12,000 plus max health as a result. This is thanks to your access to an increased number of regeneration globes throughout the map. Add in his unrivaled capability to hook and single out heroes, and it's a winning combo. Tyrael is also great at zoning and self-sustain, but his true strength in Aram comes from the allied shields and invulnerability he offers. This can come in clutch in team fights, while a well-timed Holy Ground can prevent enemies from going through their gates. Mei is a relatively versatile hero, but their most effective build sees them speccing all their talents into Icing or the Slide, to provide decent engage and buffs to allies. The ult pick is down to personal preference, as both can be comboed into other ults very effectively. Blaze, king of the engagement. The trick here is not to ignite your oil spills too quickly, as the slows can be super effective on grouped enemies. This is further increased by fuel dispersal or oil leak. Anubrak, similar to Blaze, is ace at engagement. If you have good follow-up, then speccing into Burrow Charge is very effective, though Beetles can be good for better self-sustain and push. Muradin, because of the constant team fights, I tend to go for Perfect Storm at level 1, increasing Muradin's effectiveness at endgame, while Bronzebeard's Rage and Stoneform allow for much better self-sustain once again. Lastly, ETC. Similar to Stitches, because you have access to more regen globes, you can gain max stacks of Prog Rock very quickly, offering you and your team excellent health regen, and then simply mosh your way to victory. There are 3 bruisers that squeeze their way into A tier. Firstly, we have Deathwing, since he has great sustain and area denial. You have 2 options here, either Molten Flame build if you are up against a team with low mobility, or Incinerate if you want the additional area denial. Zul has a very well-rounded toolset for teamfights, and the resurrected minions offer decent utility. I found that the most effective build revolves around his scythes, but this can be easily countered by an enemy comp heavy on ranged assassins. And lastly Varian, but specifically Colossus Smash or Taunt build variants. Twin Blades is super effective in 1v1 duels, but this isn't commonplace on a single lane map. Go Taunt if your team lacks frontline, or Colossus Smash if you have decent follow-up and burst. Lastly, ranged assassins, since once again there are no melee assassins featuring in A tier. Sorry to those Illidan mains out there. We will start with Cassia. In my opinion, there is only one route to go here. Spec everything you have into Lightning Fury, including Thunderstroke at level 1, which scales very well into late game. The ults are very much situational. For example, if you are up against heavy frontline, the bouncing ball can be effective, while Valkyrie can be very good if you're struggling to reach the backline. Junkrat has very solid poke, CC and escape. There are 2 viable builds here, my favourite of which revolves stacking all talents into the frag launcher. Taste for Explosion at level 4 allows stacking into the late game. You can also spec into your traps if you have decent follow-up and burst. Tassadar, or Laser Boy, again a reactive hero if you are against high health heroes or low mobility, then specking into the Shock Ray can be effective, but most of the time Psionic Storm build is most effective. Black Hole is good if comboed, or Archon for being better survivability. Jaina is great if you are running a multiple assassin comp, as the slows can help solo out enemies, while her Circle of Frost and Blizzard talents again are great if comboed into effective CC. Kel'Thas has the capacity to be an S tier in certain comps, since you'll be team fighting in most cases. Living Bomb build is very effective in lower ranks, but against teams with a modicum of self-awareness they can be easily countered. In these cases, specking into Convection may be more effective. The same goes for the ult. Don't go Pyroblast if you're up against shields or invulns. Chromie, there are 2 viable builds here, either Dragon's Breath for good mid-range build, or Sandblast if you are expecting a long drawn out game. Temporal Loop if you want to burst someone down, or Sands of Time for combo. Falstad, again 3 reactive builds here, Auto Attack if you are against heavy frontline, Lightning Rod for self-sustain and dueling, or Hammerang for burst with heavy CC comps. Gul'dan can win alone just based on the amount of wave clear they have, and there are 3 available comps you can go down. These are based on preference, but I prefer Fell Flame build for reliable damage output. Drain Life if you are being focused and need some additional sustain, or Corruption build if you want to destroy a heavy frontline. And finally Orphea. Now I was torn between A and B tier for Orphea, since she can be poor against teams with little frontline. I find that there is only one effective build here, but it can be devastating if used correctly, and that's specking everything into your Dread ability. Oh, and be sure to pick up Lurking Terror at level 13 and Crushing Jaws as an ult. On to B tier. These are okay options in a pinch and can be picked up if you are lacking certain role options, but should be avoided if you are given A or S tier picks. Starting with the healers. All but one of the remaining healers are here because of the utility, starting with Anna. She has a very high skill ceiling and very difficult to pick up for beginners, since everything is effectively a skill shot. There are 2 effective builds, Grenade if you have heavy frontline and need to disrupt enemy healing, or Sleep Dart if you want to single out those pesky ranged assassins. Both ults are viable, though Nano Boost is preferred if you have a mage like Li Ming. Charism is very situational, and you can spec into damaging talents like Iron Fist if you need the extra damage, but if you ever see a talent for Breath of Heaven, pick it. Seven-sided strike is only good against high health tanks. The Divine Palm is preferred in most comps. Alexstrasza is a solid healer with decent damage output, but can screw over your team with bait circles. Again, two options, either damage or healing. Putting everything into healing circle can be countered easily by anyone with good AoE, for example Azmodan and his Dunk. Or go Flame Buffet build for reliable damage and self-sustain. Late game this build is super strong as your Dragon Queen ability. And lastly, Whitemane, again a very high skill ceiling. Whitemane can be very effective if you understand how her combos work, for example heal, damage, heal, use the whip to reset desperation and repeat. There is one talent build that is effective here, but both ults are viable based on your situation and team comp. Similar to the healers, the last of the remaining tanks fall into B tier, simply because they are almost required in effective team fights. We will start with the Devil Incarnate, Diablo. His most effective build sees him speccing into Shadow Charge, allowing him to single out and punish anyone that overextends. While Devil's Due at level 1 is very good at allowing decent self-sustain, given that regen globes are plentiful. Apocalypse is the only viable ult to choose from, don't pick Lightning Breath. Mal'Ganis, there are two options here. The preferred build sees him speccing into the Sleep or Necrotic Embrace, which can allow a team comp with good communication to single out targets that overextend once again. If you are struggling for self-sustain, you can spec into all of the vampiric abilities. Carrion Swarm is preferred, but Dark Conversion is good against high health people like Stitches. Garrosh is good against lower levels since the armor is deceptively strong. Picking up Indomitable, Oppressor and Blood Craze are a must, but the tiers 1, 10 and 16 talents are situational and down to preference. For example, Warlord's Challenge at level 10 is more effective on enemies with ranged assassins. And lastly, Arthas. This was the only tank that was a contender for C tier simply because his toolset isn't very well optimised for a single lane, but he does have decent slow and CC that allows for good combos. Sindragosa is also an excellent way to push down enemy forts by capitalising on the freezing effect. Oh, and his level 1 talents will likely max stacks very early on. There are a few bruisers in tier B, starting with Hogger. For Aram, in my opinion, there is only one build that is truly effective, and that's the bomb build. Journeyman cooking at level 1 gives decent scaling and sustain, but the choice of ult is ultimately situational. Horde Pulse for better sustain once again, and Shockwave for better CC and combo into bursty abilities. Dehaka was a contender for A tier, but ultimately lacked the CC requirements for a higher ranking. What they excel in though is self-sustain, picking up the Essence Quest talents, especially those that require regen globes, and Dehaka becomes unkillable. Isolation is preferred for the combo, but adaptation can be effective if for some reason you wanted even more self-sustain. D.Va is decent at everything but not great. D.Va can also inadvertently feed the team by offering the 0.5 kills associated with losing the mech. Early game your picks are always the same: Full Metal, Rushdown, Hit the Nitrous, but 10, 13 and 16 are very much situational. Defense Matrix talents, for example, can be super useful against ranged enemies, which is likely in Aram. Rexar, similar to D.Va, is good but can slowly feed if improperly used. They are also difficult to micromanage for beginners given that you're managing 2 heroes. Strangely, 2 out of the 3 level 1 talents help with minions and mercenaries, so on Lost Caverns this is basically useless. Equally, Flare is only good against Invis, so you're a little screwed with those talents. I would suggest speccing the rest of the talents into Misha to support with the additional CC. And lastly, Imperius. Imperius would be higher in normal circumstances because of his self-sustain and dueling abilities, but ranged assassins are more likely in Aram, making him difficult to play. His optimal build picks up all of the Molten Armor talents, though if you are really struggling to reach the backline, Celestial Charge build can be an option. Just don't miss. On to B tier ranged assassins, starting with Lunara. She is super strong at singling out heroes, but you won't get the chance to do that much in Aram. Her builds don't change much and are down to preference and playstyle. Nature's Toxin is good at sustained damage, though Noxious Blossom can be super effective if comboed well with CC. The same applies for her ult picks, as Thornwood Vine is good damage, while Leaping Strike offers good mobility and escape. Tychus. This is a hero that is good in certain team comps, but can fall very short, which is why he's so low on our list. He is super useful against heroes with high health because of his trait, for example Deathwing, Stitches, Diablo. If this is the case, then spec further into your trait, or alternatively Grenade build is surprisingly good at reaching squishies in the backline for decent damage. Dragon Laser is preferred, but Odin can be effective with the Grenade build only. Another StarCraft hero, Raynor. Until the recent nerfs, Raynor was definitely S tier because of his broken Executor's talent. The standard build sees him picking up all the talents that enhance his give him some pepper ability, as this enhances damage and self-sustain. But this relies on auto attack, so if the enemy comp has heavy blinds, then this can easily be countered. Kel'Thuzad can be super effective if used properly, and this is one of the only heroes I would seriously recommend looking up a guide. His optimal build sees him speccing into the chain ability and is incredibly effective in a team with good communication because of all the CC. Frostblast is preferred, but Fissure can be super effective if you have yet more CC on your team. Nova is the first of the Invis here, though they aren't nearly as effective as in Quick Match, as your roaming capacity is inhibited. There are two solid builds here to choose, though both rely on focusing down the backline. Pinning Shot for reliable slow if you have a team that can follow up, or Snipe for just all-out damage. Bribe can also be an option on maps with mercenaries for some additional utility, and always Precision Strike, as heroes can easily block or they can duck behind structures. And lastly, Hanzo. There are two viable Hanzo builds that are situational. Auto attack is good against high health tanks, provided they lack blinds, while Storm Arrow is better for reliable poke and wave clear. Similarly, both ults are super strong, Dragon Strike for the area denial and Dragon's Fury for the additional engage. Believe it or not, we also have two melee assassins creeping their way into B tier, starting with Maiev. In the right hands and right composition, Maiev can be devastating. They excel when the enemy has lots of melee, but unfortunately this is unlikely on Aram. The preferred build sees them speccing everything into Fan of Knives, which can result in a constant barrage with instant cooldowns if used correctly. Equally, the ults are both viable, Warden Cage for extra CC or Containment Disc for isolation. And also Kira for the decent sustain and damage. Her preferred build specs into Blood Rage, since you are likely to have high stacks consistently, though you can opt for Carnage build if you are struggling with enemy poke. Again, both ults are viable and should be picked up in the same way you do with talents: Unrelenting Strikes with Blood Rage and Final Strike with Carnage. C tier. Now we're getting into those shittier heroes. Again, these should be avoided unless there is no other viable option. There is only one healer here, and that's Oriole. I'm actually a big fan of Oriole, but you can't deny their win rate in Aram is awful. They have the 13th worst win rate. Could this be down to players not understanding them or not? I don't know. Either way, the preferred build specs into Ray of Heaven, as this will scale into the late game, making it both an effective heal and defensive ability, but their mid game is very slow, as the build relies on the stacking offered at your level 16 talent. I prefer to use Crystal Aegis, as this can help counter strong CC on the enemy team. Bruisers, of which there are two in C tier. Sonya can be a good hero, but they are very easily countered. Once again, any team with a modicum of self-awareness can CC a spinning Sonya to death, removing all of her self-sustain. For this reason, I tend to choose Seismic Slam build and Leap, as this is an excellent engage to catch ranged assassins that are overextended. Secondly, Ragnaros. Similar to Raynor, Ragnaros has had one of the abilities taken away from him, as Lava Wave is banned on Aram. That being said, his trait can be effective as a defensive tool or additional push. There are a couple of viable builds here that are situational. For example, Sulfurous build is good against strong frontline, while Meteor is good if you're struggling with self-sustain. Ranged assassins, all but one of the remaining ranged assassins fall into C tier. We will start with Sylvanas. Once again, Sylvanas is super strong at wave clear and solo pushing, but this isn't very effective on a single lane map. Assassins need to be effective in a team fight, but Sylvanas' toolset doesn't help too much. I tend to spec into a hybrid build between Shadow Dagger and Haunting Waves, as this gives decent damage and escape. As for ults, this depends on preference, though I would suggest Wailing Arrow for the initiate and silence. Next we have Phoenix. He can be good if left unchecked, but poor if you're unable to reliably get off your auto attacks. This is since the only effective build specs into your auto attack, and specifically the repeater cannon. Your ults are situational, though Purification Salvo is preferred, unless you have something like Graviton Surge to combo into. Greymane once again can be super effective if you spec into the auto attack of Wolf form, but melee doesn't tend to do very well in Aram, so Cocktail build is preferred pick here, for reliable soak and wave clear. Go for the Throat is good when targeting squishies in the backline, though Silver Bullet again is good at targeting high health frontline. Next we have Tracer. She is super annoying if they can't deal with them, but if the enemy team has a bursty assassin comp with good aim, they're just dead. Tracer's builds are mostly the same with the exception of level 1 and 10 talents, which is normally situational. Sticky Bomb is good if you have a strong combo, while Pulse Rounds is good if you are left unchecked. And finally Probius. It is okay if the enemy leaves your pylons and photon cannons left unchecked, but they are very quickly countered if someone notices them. The standard photon cannon build for this reason can be good, but I would suggest speccing into Warp Rift for the additional wave clear, slow and AoE. Similarly, Pylon Overcharge can be countered, so Null Gate is a better option all round. C tier melee assassins. This is where the majority of melee assassins are placed. What you find is that they mostly have a decent toolset, but the simple fact that they are melee prevents them from getting reliable auto attacks off. Starting with Aram. Very decent toolset and situational builds, but you have to rely on sadism stacks, which is very difficult and easy to die. I would suggest going Discord Strike or Lightning Surge builds for reliable damage and engage, but Telekinesis build can be good if you are up against lots of ranged assassins. Kerrigan relies on dive into teamfights and soloing out assassins, but we've already established this doesn't work in Aram. Her best build therefore focuses on talents that spec into her spikes and shields. You can also pick up Chrysalis at 14 for some additional self-healing. Oh, and I would recommend Maelstrom since enemies will likely be grouped. Malthael has the same problem as Tychus, in that he excels at damaging high health heroes through the use of mortality. For this reason their strongest build sees them speccing into Soul Rip, while there are some recommended picks regardless of build, for example Inevitable End for the unstoppable and No One Can Stop Death for the quick resets. Butcher can be super strong late game if they can stack their fresh meat, but since there is only one lane of minions you have to rely on your hero kills. For this reason they are strong if you had good communication and can target heroes, but in most cases Butchers underperform despite having the highest win rate among all of the melee assassins in Aram. Specking into your Ruthless Onslaught talent is a good option to reliably catch and kill out of position heroes. For this reason early game for Butcher is slow, so you rely on the wave clear of allies, while Lamb of the Slaughter is recommended as this does the same thing. Murky can be challenging because of the small hit pool in the early game. Their strongest build specs into Slime as Pufferfish is easily countered on a solo map. Octograb is preferred if you're up against some pesky ranged assassins to combo into, but March of the Murlocs can actually be very useful if your team lacks wave clear. And lastly Zeratul. They are super effective at catching out of position players, able to dive in and out of combat, but this again isn't effective on Aram. The standard build, which picks up Shadowhunter at level 1, is good since you have to rely on regen globe generators. You lose momentum late game. For this reason I tend to spec into the Cleave for some reliable AoE and wave clear, while Void Prism is super good as an escape or CC. Onto the D tier. At this point you just need to full on avoid these if possible, as their abilities and talent sets are poorly optimised for Aram. Starting with the only support here, Medivh. I see Medivh as basically a worse version of Zarya. They are solid against melee heavy characters and have good escape, but they rely on their quest to stack Arcane Rift hits, but this is reset upon death, so very easily lost. Similar to Butcher, we see them being super safe early game and offering little to no help for allies. With that being said, if mastered correctly they can be super useful, but this is rare for the average player. Leyline is preferred and sets up well into other CC, but Polymorph can be super good against low level players. D tier bruisers starting with Yrel. Yrel has excellent self-sustain, but this is only effective in 1v1 duels or slow team fights. Given that Aram often goes heavy on bursty ranged assassins, Yrel doesn't fare very well. Nonetheless, if you do insist on playing them, I would spec into Vindication for further self-sustain and AoE. And Ardent Defender can get you out some sticky situations, but of course easily countered by good players. And then there's Chen. Similar to Yrel, Chen is good at sustain, but not against bursty assassins. You will often see Chens killing themselves in Aram as a result of the stagger trait. Their most effective build specs into the chug mechanic, but any team comp with an interrupt can quickly hamper this. As for ults, Wandering Keg is preferred for the combo potential, but Storm Earth Fire can be useful as an escape if you're struggling to stay alive. The last of the ranged assassins, Genji. As with most melee assassins, Genji relies on diving onto out of position enemy heroes. He deals decent single target damage, and his deflect can be devastating if the enemy team doesn't understand how it works, but if they do, it's basically useless. For this reason, I would recommend speccing into Swift Strike and Agility, giving Genji the opportunity to do OK AoE and escape. X-Strike is good when comboed, though Dragon Blade can be useful later game if the backline has little escape. And lastly, melee assassins, starting with Valera. Similar to the challenges Zeratul faced, Valera relies on catching out of position enemies, but has less escape than Zeratul. Speccing into auto attack with Hemorrhage and Strangle can be effective in teams lacking blinds, but otherwise I would suggest going full Sinister Strike to give decent burst. Choice of ults is very much situational. For example, Cloak of Shadows is good against dots like Zul's ult and Lunara's Poison. Next we have Illidan. Where to begin? Illidan relies on dive and auto attacks for self-sustain, and since Aram comps are often heavy in CC, he is left out of position and without self-sustain. For this reason, he is a very poor option unless you are able to take advantage of overextending enemies. His preferred build basically revolves around increasing the vampiric abilities and picking up friend or foe at level 7 to give the additional escape. Similarly, Metamorphosis can be used as an escape or the hunt if you are up against squishies with poor escape themselves. And lastly, Sumuro. His Windwalker build is good at roaming, but this is not very effective on a single lane map. For this reason, I would suggest going heavy on mirror talents to increase your presence in lane and be a nuisance for ranged assassins trying to hit their skill shots. This pairs well into Blade Storm at level 10 to get some decent AoE damage, but otherwise, best avoided. And finally, there are 6 other heroes that I haven't mentioned on this list since they are banned on Aram, either because they would be too OP or less than optimal. These are Abatha, Cho, Ghoul, Sergeant Hammer, Lyric and the Lost Vikings. And that's my completed tier list. If you've managed to get this far into the video without skipping, then thank you very much. As always, feel free to like, dislike or comment on this video. It helps me and the YouTube algorithm. Subscribe for more content and I will see you in the next upload.